So welcome to our latest webinar in the series Doing PR In. Today we're talking about doing PR in Switzerland. My name is Thomas Cull and I'm a consultant at CIPR in Geneva, and I'm also a member of CIPR International, which is one of the biggest groups within the Chartered Institute of Public Relations, the leading representative body for the PR profession and industry in Europe. A few words about CIPR International. Its role is to promote networking and sharing experiences among PR professionals operating in the UK and abroad. Our mission is to act both as a supportive membership organization for those working internationally and a center of excellence to public relations practitioners around the globe. We also hold regular events, which you can find on our website. And we also encourage young members through a range of initiatives, including the Douglas Smith Student Award. So today we're welcoming Clement Charles and Faryal Mirza, who are going to help us understand how to do PR in Switzerland and what is the lay of the land in terms of communications. Do remember that this webinar is accredited for CIPR CPD, so don't forget to log it. And I'd also like everyone to answer a few short questions in the questionnaire that will be sent out in a couple of hours. So, without further ado, just a quick overview of the agenda for the webinar. So I will start with providing a quick overview of Switzerland from a geopolitical perspective. Clement will then take over and give an overview of French-speaking Switzerland, followed by Faryal, who will give an overview of German-speaking Switzerland, and then we'll proceed to the Q&A. So a few quick words about myself. I live and work in Geneva, and I have been here since over a year. Prior to that, I was working in London in other communications consultancies. So I can share experiences in terms of media and communications in the UK versus that of in Switzerland. A few words about CPC, Cabinet Privé de Conseil, where I work. It's a Swiss PR and public affairs consultancy which covers the whole Swiss market in French, German, and English, amongst other languages. And a lot of my own work focuses on clients in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, mainly because I either work with them in English or in French. I don't speak German. And that will soon become clear as to why languages is an important part of doing communications. Mm-hmm. So a little bit about the Swiss mosaic or structure and lay of the land. So one thing that's important to know is that there are 4 linguistic regions. On the slide in front of you, the blue part is Western Switzerland, and that's the French-speaking part of Switzerland, or Suisse romande. And the orange bit is the German-speaking part of Switzerland. The green is Ticino, the Italian-speaking part, and the yellow bits are Romanche, so that's the local Swiss language. Overall, there are 26 cantons, or states, and within those, it's broken down to communes, and there are around 2,600 communes. One particularity of Switzerland is something called the Röstigraben. And that's a linguistic and largely also a cultural border separating Western French-speaking Switzerland and the German-speaking part of Switzerland. And Clement and Faryal will also be talking in more detail about the role that plays when we talk about communications and media relations. Switzerland itself is roughly the size of Estonia, if that's a measure for anybody, and the population is around about the 8 million mark. So it's, generally speaking, a small market and a small country, but quite complex when it comes to media, governmental affairs, and public affairs. One neat particularity is that there's no single national publication per se. There is an exception, Clement might touch on it later, which is in the form of teletext. But because of the linguistic differences, there's no one publication which has the same stories with the same editorial across the whole of the country. So to summarize that, the Swiss media is defined by Switzerland's peculiarity in terms of its federalism and multilingualism. And the media landscape can be characterized by a decentralized press, a strong local and regional presence, and one of the highest per inhabitant number of publications. This slide just shows or illustrates federalism within Switzerland. So it's a federal state. So a lot of the state power is shared between the federal government, the cantons or states, and the communes. And the cantons and the communes, respectively, have broad scope in actually carrying out their responsibility. So while the confederation might be looking after things such as foreign relations and defense, the national road network, the cantons actually have quite a bit of freedom on how they interpret some of these rules and regulations and how they implement them, and can actually have quite a lot of responsibility in the areas of education and healthcare and cultural affairs and police matters, to name a few examples. Then if you even go down further into the communes, they also sometimes even have their own governments and their own parliaments, depending on the size. So all of this is just to illustrate and to explain briefly that the decision-making structure in Switzerland is just as complex as the language and the geopolitical side of things. So one short cartoon to underline the points that I made. And now I would like to hand over to Clement, who will give an overview of the French-speaking part of Switzerland. Clement.
Thank you, Thomas, for this great introduction. As requested, I'll start with a very short introduction about myself. So my name is Clement Charles, and I'm the CEO and the founder of a news agency called All the Content. And All the Content is a news provider, content provider that provides the right content to enable media and corporation to attract and retain traffic in more than 42 languages since 2001. Our model is based on a mix of having our own network of freelancers with nearly 2,000 talents and third-party provider like Reuters or 200 smaller partners that provide us with great quality content that we then sell to website, publishers, broadcaster, telecommunication company, airlines, digital signage provider, and any other platforms that actually is able to pay for the rights. All the content is at the core of the media market in Switzerland, but it also in other few markets. And therefore, without doing PR ourselves, we have a lot of relationship with PR companies, mainly with our ability to actually receive one product, one press release, one communication for the PR agency, and then being able to broadcast the news in many of the canals that we have, in many of the channels that we have among our clients. So our experience with PR is more to be contacted by a PR agency, for them to provide us and propose us interesting subjects to cover, and then to actively work with them in order to give the visibility we think relevant to the subject they provide us. Also on the side, we know the difficulties of PR because we're also a medium-sized company and we want to promote ourselves, and therefore we are like any companies which wants to make their speech and message interesting for the media in a landscape where media don't have a big attention span for us. So that's my quick overview about me and myself. You'll be more than welcome to learn more on the internet or with a direct contact. Talking about the French part of Switzerland, that's something which is a very vast subject, even if we speak about the tiny country and the nano part of this country. First of all, to complement what Thomas has said, it's really important to understand and grasp the fact that in Switzerland, the local units are the most important units, both in terms of politics, in terms of local government, but also in terms of how people live their life, pay their tax, and therefore have and enjoy a media landscape. To give you an example, police, education, tasks as fundamental as those are actually at all the time managed at the canton level, and there is 26 of those units in Switzerland. So as Thomas said, what's managed on the national level, it's the roads, it's the army, it's the relationship with the rest of the world, the UN, the European Union. So it's mostly things that people don't see in their daily life. And most of what they see, is there a school, is there a place for my kid, how much tax do I pay, where do I actually put my recycling bin, etc. All of this is decided at the local level. Logically, this impacts a lot the landscapes in terms of media in terms of media consumption practice by the users, and logically in terms of media communication by all the stakeholders of the industry. I'd like to add something else, something which is often not really understood and which may seem a bit strange, but to be in Geneva like I am, to be in the French part of Switzerland, it's something which is very strange because you are in a part which is very well known internationally. Everyone knows Geneva because of the UN, the WTO, and all the international organizations. But at the Swiss level, you know and you feel on your daily basis that you are in the dominated part of the country, that all the decisions that are important nationwide are always considered only on a, let's say, Swiss-German perspective. And I'm not saying that to complain at all, because that's the way Switzerland is working, and it's also very strongly rooted in the Swiss culture to be independent and to run your own things and run your own business. But I think it's very important to know and translate into the economics, into the business, in something very easy. In Switzerland, all the what we call the national champions, the biggest supermarket, the biggest clothes chain, the biggest shoe chain, all the people that actually serve the Swiss every day tends to be based and originated from the German part of the country. On the other side of the spectrum, most of the Swiss company, most of the Swiss company that actually are massive international firms like Nestle, like Serono, like Logitech, most of them comes from the French part of the country, French-speaking part of the country, which is actually a very good way to show that it's a lot easier for us to go in Paris, to go in London, to go in Milan, to sign a deal, than it actually is to Zurich. And in many cases, it's only once you succeeded as a guy from Geneva, a guy from Lausanne, a guy from Fribourg in another country that actually people from the other side of the Röstigraben actually come to you and say, well, maybe what you propose could also be interesting for us. So we really have that feeling, and I really speak about a feeling because that's something which is very, very, very important into the Swiss relation, and especially into the media, where logically in a country which is as fragmented in terms of language that we are, there is an important part of public legislation and public funding in the media landscape. So that's the first thing I want to say about Switzerland. And now to go to the media part, I think it would be fair and relevant to fragment and share and split the market in three major type of companies in the French part of Switzerland. You have what I will call the big groups, right? And those big groups are like any big media group in the world. They have a lot of gain, a lot of profit, but also a lot of pain, due not only to the disruption which is brought by the digital, but also in general by the evolution of the consumption practice of the audience. There, I would say mainly three group, and I would assume that a part of those would also be in Fariol's presentation about the German part. As I said, national champions tends to come from the other side of the Röstigraben. So the biggest group in our part of the country is actually TA Media, Tages and Zeiger Media, which is a group which is quite recently operating under this name, and which actually acquired one of the major Swiss, French-speaking Swiss groups already 10 years ago. The old group was called EduPress, and it was a very good example of what I was saying before. It was a leader in the Romandy part, so in the French-speaking part, and they had nearly no operation in the rest of Switzerland, but they were also a leader in Eastern countries, in Spain, in Asian countries, and stuff like that. And at the other end of the spectrum, Tages and Zeiger was a center-left publication in Zurich 25 years ago when I started in the business, and they actually took the digital shift very early and very correctly, which actually allowed them to accumulate a massive pile of wealth and revenues that were then used since the past 15 years to acquire other Swiss groups. This group, TA Media, they run the most, what I will call popular media in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. And when I speak media there, it's mainly printed magazine and printed newspaper and their online equivalent, of course, with mobile apps, OTT apps, and other kind of let's say, platforms to access the same kind of content. The other big group, which is in massive trouble at the moment, it's called Ringier, and they actually have two parts. One part which is operated under their own name, Ringier, and another part which is operated in cooperation with the German group Axel Springer, which is called Ringier Axel Springer. They have also a few magazines, mainly weekly magazines, monthly magazines, and they have the main, what we could call serious kind of economic newspaper in Switzerland, the French-speaking part, which is called Le Temps, the Times. TA Media, like Ringier, and heavily depends on indirect revenue. What I mean is that most of the revenue doesn't come from the user paying for the content, paying for the titles, but from advertising, which is used to rent the audience that the actual media could collect. The last big player, which is very important because of the nature of the Swiss market, it's the public services, which is called SSR, SRG. It's again, and you will see that many times in Switzerland, a vague way to find the balance between the national language. So don't try to find any sense behind the acronym. The idea is that the Swiss Public Broadcasting Corporation is operating in all the parts of the country. In all the parts of the country, they have 2 to 3 to 4 channel in the local language on the television, and they also have a number between 3 to 12 channels of radio. They also have very active activities on online media, not only by providing quality websites or application, but also by providing a whole range of media services and content services to other kind of platforms. That latter part is actually a field of conflict with the rest of the private sector, because, as I mentioned earlier, most of the other media group are relying on ads, when they're, as the public service, they mainly rely on a part, subsidies, a fee, which a license fee, which is collected at my place, at your place, at everyone's citizen's place, and used to pay the public services. In terms of quality, unlike in other country, the public services is quite has a positive feedback. Generally, the Swiss population tends to enjoy the local content which is produced for them, and they also, and this actually totally reflects in terms of numbers, where you see the Swiss television having 30, 40, 45, 50% of the market share, depending on the program that they have on one night. So they actually are in line with the need and the demand of the population. And it's not my opinion, it's something that you can see in the results of the audience. Then, if you go one step lower in the ladder, you have smaller groups, which are emerging now. Emerging because as they were smaller, it was a lot easier for them to actually adapt themselves to the evolving landscape with the digital and the disruptive consumption practice on the user side, but also because the fact that the big groups are very focused on profitability, very focused on keeping what they had, and they don't have a lot of agility in terms of business development. They also capture part of the business that are left untouched by the bigger groups. There, I would like to cite you 4 different groups, which are very different, and also by themselves give a good example of how the Swiss market may be a bit different than other markets of similar size. As Thomas says in the introduction, Switzerland has a very small amount of population. The whole Switzerland is smaller than the inner part of Paris, for example, in terms of population. But at the other end of the spectrum, in terms of PR, we have one of the highest concentration in the world of media per inhabitants. In the French part of Switzerland, there is a bit below 2 million inhabitants, and there is about 15 daily newspapers that are published every day, more than 200 weekly newspapers or magazines that are published every week. So it's a market when you have a ratio of amount of people versus the amount of media, where the ratio is very high in favor of Swiss being people that consume a lot of media and enjoy to have media that reflect their personal fragmentation of the country. Those 4 groups that I want to quote now would be I choose those four groups because they were, in my perspective, in terms of revenue, the people that were exactly in the second stage. So they are all between, let's say, 10, 15 or to 50 million in revenue. I will quote General Media. General Media, it's a new company. They didn't exist 15 years ago. They provide paper publication, about 5 to 6, but also dozens of high quality websites. They rely on very high quality, rich content, and very originally, a good half of their revenue doesn't provide from advertising, but from direct revenues, which means that users are actually paying to access this content, paying to access what the publisher actually publish, which is always a good sign of being relevant when actually people pay you to be sure that they can hear you. Then second network or group that I want to mention is called Virtual Networks. Their flagship is called Romandie.com. Romandie is the other name you may use to speak about the French-speaking part of Switzerland, a name which is actually more correct and the one that we use ourselves to define ourselves. Romandie.com is one of the most visited websites in Switzerland, despite the fact that it's actually more or less a headline aggregator, but still it was launched maybe 22 years ago, and therefore it still holds a huge part of the market today. And those guys, based on this success, they have launched about a cluster of 100 or 150 websites in many verticals that are now, in terms of traffic, they are the third biggest traffic owner and provider in Switzerland. I'd like to conclude with Inedi Publication, which is quite an original company, which initially was more, let's say, a communication agency, and that from opportunities to opportunities actually became a media group holding, owning, publishing and distributing more than 200 what we call nano publication or mini publication that are actually just for one city, for one NGO, for one professional group of people. That leads me to the latter part, which is actually those two first type of people I mentioned are important in the Swiss ecosystem. There are definitely people you need to touch and have in your vision if you want to address Switzerland as a market, but they are not the only sources that Swiss people may use. In Switzerland, there is two things which are, from my experience and my knowledge, quite rare in other European countries. The first one is the idea that there is a very strong importance of trade publication. The most printed magazine in Switzerland, as well as the second one, actually both belong to a supermarket chain. So Migros magazine, the biggest supermarket in Switzerland, but also the biggest provider of job in Switzerland. They're also the most printed publication in Switzerland. It's a weekly magazine printed at around 2 million copies. Their main competitor, called the Coop, is also, they are the second in supermarket, but also the second in publishing content, as their magazine, I think it's called Cooperation, is distributed widely in nearly all the Swiss mailboxes every week. So that's something which is very interesting because it gives an interesting angle about what's actually national in Switzerland, coming back to what Thomas was saying. He mentioned quickly the teletext. The teletext is a tool that most of you, if you live in northern country, may know and use, which is actually the way to make appear an interactive text services on your television, and which is in Switzerland, like in many German, like in Germany, like in the Netherlands, like in the UK, actually quite intensely used by the user on a daily basis. It is said that 1 every 2 Swiss go to the teletext every day. And that's one of the only media which has a centralized newsroom and tends to display the same content in the 3 national language at the same time. Then on the other end of the spectrum, the other national media is the one I mentioned, the trade publication or the, let's say, corporate marketing, content marketing publications such as Migros magazine or Coop magazine. Secondly, I can give you another good example, which is bluewin.ch. It's the portal of the telecom operator Swisscom, but it's always in the top 5 of the ranking in terms of traffic, mainly because a good third of the Swiss population has a @bluewin mailbox, and that they have to connect on the site to actually access their webmail. So that's something which is very interesting in terms of PR. It means that publication that has the more notoriety or the more glory are in terms of efficiency of the communication structure, not always the one to be selected because they don't reach the same amount of the audience that other publications that are, let's say, less prestigious, but actually have a stronger circulation. I'll conclude on the local and very local. As mentioned, the fact that we at All the Content, we're a content provider. We run many services for our clients. And one of the services that we run with a great deal of success is to create local TV channel for cities. And in Switzerland, where if you are cities with 35,000 people, 40, 50,000 people, you're already in the top 10 of the biggest Swiss cities. So that's something which is very difficult to understand if you come from a 50, 60, 80 million inhabitants country, is the fact that for us, a city is the administrative unit which is actually hugely small in terms of international standards, but actually relevant in terms of Swiss standards, because that's where you pay your tax. That's actually those guys who decides how many kindergarten places there is and when or where you can actually put your trash. So very concrete questions. In that regards, I was mentioning the 14 daily newspapers. A good half of those is actually published very, very locally to a region which at maximum would be a region of 100,000 people if you include all the possible readership. So that's something which is also very particular to the Swiss people and also related to the, let's say, level of wealth that we have in Switzerland, which is not as you think. All of us are not bankers running in gold cars to actually go to the chocolate factory and get a precious watch every day, but still, which is a lot higher than in many of the European countries or the Western countries. And therefore, this wealth in terms of revenues also translates in the ability to finance and fund media that will have no economic sense in other markets. I'll conclude about doing PR in Switzerland, and I'm very open for the question you may have, but I'll conclude on the Swiss specificities, which I would assume Fariel would maybe confirm or vary, that are common to the whole country. First of all, Swiss people don't like to say no. It's very rare that you have a straight no if you have asked a question. You have a yes, and if it's a yes, it's a yes. You're not in the US, you're not in other countries where you've got to moderate every positive feedback. But if the product or the pitch that you're doing is really not interesting, the guy doesn't want to feel uncomfortable and be impolite and tell you that your product is actually not worth it. He would prefer to say, well, okay, let's speak later, and then you will relaunch by email. Okay, I'll give you a feedback later on. So that's something which is very interesting and also which may surprise efficient professionals that are used to a quick and very transparent communication flow. The other thing that I want to add is about English. In Switzerland, the literacy of English is quite high. English is actually perceived quite positively by the Swiss people. On my personal Swiss ID card, I have all the information which are also written in English. But on the other end of the spectrum, because of what I just said, no one is keen to tell you that he didn't really understood what you meant in English. Therefore, if you have a meeting here in Geneva or in Zurich and the whole meeting is in English, just be sure of the level of literacy of the people you speak with. Because if they don't understand, well, they don't want to look stupid and ask you to repeat every 2 sentences what you just said. So that's something which is very, very important, and even more in the German part of Switzerland, if you allow me, Fariel, to go on your way, which is even more there, because as they are the dominant part of the country, they feel, and they are right to feel so, that you should speak their own language. When here in Geneva, as we are used to be dominated by another language, it's actually a lot more easy to find people that will have the same level that you would expect in terms of English literacy to actually convey and carry your message through in a clear manner. For me, that's it about the landscape. I will conclude on saying that Switzerland is a country where people don't say a lot. They dislike things, as I mentioned before, the no, speaking about the no part, but also that they have a very strong feeling about what they like or dislike, and that they never promote or enjoy or support things that doesn't seem to go their way. And that's something where I think could be a good conclusion, which is, as the cartoon is just saying now below me or next to me, Switzerland is a tiny market with a very high wealth potential, but it's also a complex market to get in, and it's a market to be considered more as a fragmented market composed of multiple markets that are next to the other than one single market to be addressed as a whole. And my conclusion would be that this is actually very well reflected in the organization of the biggest international firms that tends to have run Zurich from Munich, to run Geneva from Paris, and to run the Ticino part where they speak Italian from Milano. That's not the best way to be a Swiss leader, but it's definitely a relevant and an efficient way to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Clement. Farial, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you to you both to your very insightful comments and into the Swiss market. So I'm Farial Mirza. I'm a communications practitioner who's been based in Switzerland for almost 15 years now, originally a Londoner, but now very much at home in Bern, Switzerland's capital city, and coincidentally in a canton which actually says it's a bilingual canton. So it has two languages, official languages, German and French. Now, as for my own communications experience, it's primarily in international communications in the not-for-profit sector, particularly with the UN. And I've just now moved over to the academic sector where I'm working for the University of Bern with a mandate to create and implement its first international communication strategy. And prior to that, back in the days, I was a journalist and editor in broadcast, print and web. Now, today I'm very pleased to be addressing you because of your interest in two topics very close to my heart, international communications and CPD. Now, I myself take CPD very seriously, and I hope you are too. Clearly, if you're watching this webinar at a later stage, you will be. I myself am an accredited practitioner and also hold the CIPR postgraduate diploma in PR. So let's move on. Whoops, I can see that my presentation appears to have a life of its own. So I'll try and get it back to the first page. So now as we were preparing for this webinar, we all took a long, hard think about what could interest you as an audience, as communications practitioners looking to target your activities to audiences in Switzerland. Now, the rule of thumb in strategic communications, which we're all very familiar with, is to know your audience, and that's no less true for Switzerland. Now, as we've already heard from both Tom and Clement, the country is actually quite hard to pigeonhole, and Switzerland displays a special kind of diversity. Now, Clement has already given us a very, very, very nice overview of the entire country, with some zooming on the French-speaking part, and I'll, of course, try to focus a bit more on the German-speaking part, and also to look at the other languages present, or rather omnipresent, if one refers to English in this country. So let's take a slightly broader look. We've all heard this already before, but as you can see, we're talking about really a nation of polyglots. Those with German as their main language, just over 60%. And here you have just a graph to just show this. And of course, we have the four national languages, with French in second place, Italian and Romansh. So, you know, four national languages, quite simple, right? But of course, the picture is never as simple as that, as my colleagues have already made quite clear. Now, according to recent surveys from the Federal Statistic Office, about 5% of Switzerland's permanent residents actually say that English is their main language. And on top of that, as far as the German-speaking part is concerned, German speakers, half of them in Switzerland, say they regularly use English as a second language. And in fact, it seems they use English more than they do French, although they do use French quite highly as well. Now, moving on to how linguistically varied the Swiss population are. We know that at least 2/3 of them are using more than one language a week, and almost 40% use 2 languages. And one thing that the different linguistic regions can bond with over is actually their use of English. Because also in the French part, we've also got very high figures. Clément, you've already referred to it, but again, 40% of those in the French-speaking part who say French is their first language will also be regularly using English as a second language. So if we just move very briefly onto the media landscape, thoroughly support everything that Clément has said, and I just want to add just one or two facts or figures. And we're talking about a country with over 406 titles. A title is defined as dailies, weeklies, Sunday papers. 81% of those are actually in German. And what's very interesting about the Swiss population is that it seems that while other countries seem to be experiencing a downward trend in people reading print newspapers, the Swiss still very much like to read newspapers in print, with figures showing that they spend at least half an hour a day doing this. I also privately wonder whether there's some correlation between reading your papers and having a good breakfast in Switzerland, but I'm sure that could be the subject of a social science project at the university here where I work. Maybe I could suggest it. But what we can already see with this amazingly high number of newspapers available, that for those who are perhaps considering communications campaign where advertising is also part of the mix, there is potentially quite a phenomenal outreach. Let's just a very brief look at some of the top papers in German, just so that you have an idea of what some of the titles are. Now, amongst the top 7, the actual top 2, 20 Minuten, also has a French counterpart called 20 Minuten, and also Blick am Abend. These are actually free papers, and as I'm sure my colleagues will testify, I mean, just anecdotally, these papers, you can see people reading them everywhere, and I've seen, people of all generations reading them. Sometimes it, worries me a little bit to see children reading them, because I think the content sometimes is, well, I would say it's not really suitable for children under the ages of 10 or even 15, but it seems to be very popular with that demographic, anecdotally speaking, at least in our neighbourhood. And Blick, which you see is number 3 on the list, is what we would call in Britain a red top or a tabloid, while the others, most of the others, as you can see, are more or less what we would call the broadsheets. Now, the NZZ, Zurich base, is the oldest of them all, but quite widely read across Switzerland, and is quite well respected for the breadth and depth of its international coverage, which is provided by its very own network of some 40 foreign correspondents across the globe. And you also have the Tagesanzeiger and the Bund in Bern, which have some content sharing now, but they both also have quite respected reputations with a left-of-centre approach. Now, just very briefly onto TV and radio, which again has already been covered. Clément's already mentioned the dominance of SRF as the public broadcaster, and we also know that given Switzerland's geographical position in the heart of Europe, that there is very easy access to foreign channels, whether it's cable or digitally. And as far as news coverage, particularly from the SRF, I can only support what Clément said, that indeed content there indeed has a very good reputation. And as someone who was a journalist before, I have to say that I still continue to enjoy a lot of the reportages that are regularly aired, particularly radio and television. So, of course, all of this very high quality coverage by the SRF comes at a price. And we know that this may actually, well, this over the years has caused quite a lot of consternation in various parts of the Swiss population and, of course, in political circles. So very soon there will be a popular vote on actually whether the SRF should still be entitled to be able to use the license fees. But we know that in other countries, I mean, if you look at Britain as well, there are similar discussions about the BBC license fees as well. So, if we just now, I thought it would be worth actually, given the focus that I already had at the beginning of the presentation on the number of English speakers in Switzerland, there are a plethora of news sites targeted at English English speakers living in Switzerland. I know from my time in Swiss journalism, it seemed to be quite the sort of the holy grail of the Swiss media landscape, how to really monitorize this very large number of English speakers in Switzerland. And, you know, there have been outfits with various degrees of success. Now, one of the players, which is actually is funded by public money, is Swiss Info, which not only goes out in English, but in 8 other languages as well. You know, as disclosure, it was one of the outfits that I used to work for when I first arrived in Switzerland. But it seems here, you know, funded by taxpayer money, but also with a clear mandate to communicate about Switzerland with a focus on the Swiss living abroad, who are still entitled to vote in Swiss elections. Now, I just wanted to very quickly mention that there's a big buzz at the moment about another entrant to the market. CNN has just announced that they are entering into a joint venture to start up a television channel in English called CNN Money Switzerland. And the hype around that is quite high at the moment, and I believe that we should be seeing some developments with a possible launch later this year. So that's one to keep an eye out for. Now, if we just now move over to the Swiss PR landscape, this, of course, you know, as we know, is probably very relevant for you if you decide that you need to recruit local help for your campaign. And as Clement has already mentioned, there is an extremely vibrant PR sector relative to the size of the country. So there are a multitude of PR practitioners available here, whether they're working for large firms or, particularly in this part of the world, say 1 or 2 person outfits, or sometimes indeed as a network of sole practitioners. So help is definitely at hand. Now, in one way, this very much reflects the diversity of the population that you see here in Switzerland, with these agencies of all sizes catering for all needs. And of course, this can have an advantage when you're really trying to do very precise audience targeting. You can really get it down to a T, which again, the relative size of Switzerland's audience actually enables you to do that. As far as the actual market for PR services is concerned, we have some estimates which are based partly on the Association of largest PR agencies in Switzerland. And I think conservatively we can estimate this market to be worth around 120 million Swiss francs. Now, in terms of my own experience with procuring PR services in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, it's mainly with small to medium-sized enterprises. And of course, a lot of agencies are based in Zurich, the financial capital of Switzerland, but there are a fair number also here in Bern as the federal capital. Now, as an aside, it may also be interesting for you to look a bit further afield to the east of the country. For instance, St. Gallen also has quite a good reputation, also in terms of some of the PR agencies which are, you know, up and coming there, and some which are clearly more established in the market. And this may, of course, have something to do with the fact that it has quite a strong focus as a city on innovative graphic design. So that pretty much rounds up some of the insights that I wish to bring to you in this presentation. And I hope that there was something of use which would provide helpful insights to guide you as you explore doing PR in Switzerland. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And also, thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Farial. Thank you both so far for giving us your insights. So we'll now turn over to Q&A. So one of the first questions that's come through is, are PR agencies usually local or affiliates of global PR firms? I will maybe start by handing over the question to both of you, and then I can round up with any other insights from myself. So just starting it maybe alphabetically. Clement, would you want to answer that question?
Yeah, quickly, on my end, I would say most of the PR agency we have contact with are local PR agency or PR services which are directly internalized.
Yes, that would
in the
also
bigger
reflect
firms.
my experience that they are mostly local or regional. I can think of one or two very large global PR firms which do have branches in Switzerland, but maybe that's something, Thomas, you can give us a bit more information about.
Sure. So just the first top-level comment is that, for example, in contrast to the UK or maybe even the US, the PR agency's scope in Switzerland is quite restricted in comparison. So whereas in the UK you might have hundreds of PR agencies of all shapes and sizes, including huge multinational ones, that's not the case here in Switzerland. Farial alluded to a couple of multinational ones, so there are the likes of Burson Marsteller and Weber Shandwick, which have a presence in the Swiss market. But equally, they come up against very strong competition from local consultancies and agencies. And the reason behind strong competition from the local ones is the relationships and the networks that, at least from my experience, and I'm slightly biased because I work for a Swiss and local consultancy, but in my perspective, it is the local and Swiss consultancies that offer the best sorts of relationships, the best sorts of networks to plug clients into. So that's maybe kind of a classic dilemma or comparison for when private sector companies think to engage with, whether it's a multinational in a market or if it's a local consultancy and an agency in the local market. Okay, going on to another question that's come through. Are there any issues around talent management and indeed recruitment challenges? I will start with Clement again.
Yeah, for me, it's a huge challenge. As a CEO and as an entrepreneur, active in Switzerland, but running my business in many markets, I think that's the biggest weakness of the Swiss market. If you're looking for communication, managing talents, we've got a lot of engineers, we've got a lot of people able to come with great idea, invention, and patents, but not a lot of good executioners, communication manager, marketers. That's not what we have more here in Switzerland, from my experience. That's
well, I can only
problem.
comment on the small and medium-sized agencies I've worked with in Switzerland, and I have to say that my experience has been here in this part of the world that I guess it's the same in anywhere. It's to do with the relationship building, and sometimes with companies that are slightly smaller, that perhaps the turnover is not so high. I found with some of the medium-sized ones, which in the time that we worked with them, they got very big and very successful, which is great for business, but we noticed that with one or two of them where we had been a long-time client, that as soon as they got very big, they did really have problems with turnover. And you know, sometimes again, you are also building relations within these agencies, and that's not so easy then to build up again if the turnover is very high.
Mm.
Just to add something, I think it's also related to the liquidity of the job market in Switzerland. It's very easy to find a job. Therefore, it's also very easy to leave your job. You make a meeting with your manager. You're not happy. Well, the next morning you leave the company. And I think it's also related to that compared to other markets where there is a bigger tension on the job market. Well, here it's quite easy if you have talent to monetize your talent in different ways. And if you can't, the state will cover some of the fees for you. So people don't hesitate to leave as soon as there is a hassle. So definitely the turnover, even within established companies.
And I would echo those views from my side. Based on everything that I've heard from our industry, so the PR and communications consulting industry, there is quite a bit of a challenge in finding the right caliber and the right sorts of profiles of talent to fill potential roles. in part, that's reflective of the complexity of Switzerland, because the natural instinct for a consultancy such as ours is to recruit someone who is already familiar with A, Switzerland as a market, and B, Switzerland as the communications and the media landscape, which is complex in its own right. So while there might be quite a few very seasoned, very experienced professionals, for example, from neighboring France, applying for communications roles in the Geneva region, if the role that needs to be filled is external communications and external and stakeholder engagement, for example, they would unfortunately be at a disadvantage to, for example, someone who's already been working and living in Switzerland for a prolonged period of time. So I think that's kind of my perspective on talent management. Also, I would just add to that there are again fluctuations in the market, depending, for example, on how big multinationals hire and fire. So I'm familiar with one or two enterprises which have gone through a round of redundancies, and as a result, the anecdotal evidence that I've heard is that now the market is gradually getting saturated with quite a few people from these multinationals, and in turn, that's making it more difficult for some people to find work. So that's another thing that can have an impact. Mm-hmm. Another question has come through: what role does digital and social media play in Switzerland? Let's again start with Clement.
Well, the same than everywhere else, I would say.
Indeed, indeed. And Fariel,
central.
Would you have any different experiences with digital and social media?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about a very digitally savvy population who, I think, again, more than 80% are online. We have a lot of people also using the internet for their news, or rather reading the news on their mobiles as well, which of course seems to be a bit of a contradiction when you consider how much they still like reading their newspapers in print. So we have that as well. So yes, I mean, as Clement has also said, it's important, and I think also, I don't know whether Clement can add a bit on this, but we know that we recently had some popular votes in Switzerland where social media really was used to campaign to increase awareness of certain issues amongst especially the much younger
social media is interestingly used
population.
In political campaigns, because something which is very specific to the Swiss democracies compared to other is that we vote very often. I would say every 6 to 8 weeks we have a vote about something at the local, regional or national level, and that's very true that since the past 2 to 3 years, but I would say even since the 2011 parliamentary election, the importance of social media, and I would say within those Facebook, is really central. But I think it's more related to also the ability of the granularity that you can have in those social media when you have a very local vote. Well, Facebook is a great platform because you can only address people that actually have the voting rights in the segment of the population that you want. So I think it's very used, but I would not say it's new, because of what was said, the, let's say, tech-savviness of the population. The mobile penetration rate was at 120% already in 2005. There is a 98% high-speed internet penetration rate. So it's not very new. Last but not least, in terms of political communication, we are, because of what I just said, because of the fact that we are in a market where people vote a lot, there is a huge amount of money which are invested in political communication. And what is done today in social media is not so different than what was done in the streets with posters when I was a kid. So the communication strategy are, let's say, always the same. It's a strategy where each stakeholder of the vote will say to the others that if you vote X or Y, you will actually die and Switzerland will disappear. That's the general pitch. And then the reason why it will disappear, well, it varies in terms of the political opinions. So I would definitely go with the fact that it's a very important part of the communication structure today, but A, I would say not really more important than in other markets, and B, with a behavior which is actually very similar to the one which is on other communication canal. For example, on Facebook during the vote, you have none of the candidates or the promoter of an object that will organize a live debate with comments. No, none of those. So they don't really use the interactive function of the tool. They just use this as another canal to actually display the message from the sender.
And I would just add a couple of facts that I have here. So 50% of users of mobile phone users in Switzerland, smartphone users, actually use it to read the news. 57% use mobile phones to read the news. And if we look at Switzerland in terms of how they use mobile phones, it's more broadly speaking, it's higher than in France and higher than in the USA, actually. So quite smartphone and digital savvy population. I think we have time for one more question. What is the education landscape like in relation to communications and PR? Perhaps, Faria, I'll start with you on that one.
Well, it is possible in Switzerland to qualify as so-called, I only know in German, but I think it's the Eidgenössische PR-Berater, which I think translates as a federal PR advisor. And it's I'm more familiar with actually how you can qualify from a continuing education perspective, but it is like a federal qualification that will be recognized across the country. In terms of doing it as usually as someone who has some, you have to have either some work experience and or show that you have already have education to a certain degree. And there you, in the two big schools that offer it here, it's possible to do it as you're working as well. I think technically it takes about 2 semesters. It is, in my view, quite pricey. And it's, however, fairly well respected. I don't actually personally know many people who've actually done the qualification, but that doesn't mean anything. And I think it will give you the breadth of the PR education that one would need. Of course, there are a number of degrees that one can do this. One can study communications. Again, I'm not very familiar actually, though, whether you would really get, let's say, the more practical.
Great. Clement, is there anything that you would add to Fariel's response?
PR advisor here in Switzerland on those degree courses, but you are likely to get that on the federal advisor course.
A lot of the PR practitioners I'm in contact with tends to be old journalists, recycled journalists. So that's another let's say, source for those kind of professionals, with maybe appreciated for the communication skills, but mainly I would say, as it was said earlier, for their actual.
Well, look, we're running out of time, so I'd like to thank both Clement and Fariel very much for your time and providing us with insights into what is clearly a very interesting, yet not such an easy market to understand. Thank you very much for this interesting session. Details, just one final word, is that details for everyone are on the CIPR website, ciprinternational.com. If you would like to contact us. Please don't forget to log this on your CPD and to answer the questionnaire that you will get afterwards. And if you'd like to be involved in more events with CIPR International, or if you'd like to join us and participate as a volunteer, you can write to us at international@cipr.co.uk. Thank you, everybody.